Hello, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Webcast, Objects at Heights, Awareness and Solutions, sponsored by Ergodyne. My name is Kyle Morrison. I'm the Senior Associate Editor with Safety and Health Magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you all for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. The views of the speaker and his organization are his own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorse them. At the conclusion of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. You can feel free to ask a question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but due to the high number of participants, we may not get to all the questions. However, any unanswered questions will be forwarded on to today's speaker. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the presentation concludes. This webcast will be archived for 3 months, so you can access it after today's live presentation. Within about a day, just simply return to the same URL address, and you can access the webcast. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to begin. Our speaker today is Nate Bombach. He's a product manager at Ergodyne who has worked on height safety solutions for more than 5 years. Nate?
Thanks, Kyle. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you might be. Our topic today is Objects at Heights, knowing the risks associated with the subject and how to effectively manage those risks through implementation of best practice and things like that in the workplace. You'll see a variety of educational tools, including this presentation we'll go through, and also worksite solutions to complement them focused on this topic in order to help you implement the best Objects at Heights strategy. Okay. At Ergodyne, we encourage all of you to implement a drops-free zone at every worksite. Our campaign is eye-catching. It's a theme to help draw attention to the subject matter and get workers to start asking questions about it. Okay, so let's go through our agenda. We'll preview what we're going to cover today. First, we'll go over our goals and what we hope to get out of the presentation. Then we'll jump to a larger topic that's safety at heights and discuss how Objects at Heights fits into that hierarchy. We'll continue with a deeper dive into the subject matter, discussing the hazards and its components. And we'll follow with the costs associated with those hazards and why they are important to manage properly. Finally, we'll discuss different types of solutions and how to use the hierarchy of controls, for those of you who are familiar with it, to implement these solutions. Because of time constraints, as Kyle mentioned, please forgive us if we hold the majority of questions till the end. If we don't get to them, we'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards. So what is our goal today? What's our strategy? What's our goal? It's to turn all of you on the call into deputy drop cops. Well, the next obvious question then is what is a drop cop? Well, first we'll want to learn what makes up Objects at Heights safety and how it fits into safety at heights planning. Then we'll become aware of the costs associated with dropped objects and the other Objects at Heights hazards. When you know those hazards, that you can then determine what the best practice is for your individual work site and application. Finally, we want you to know that it's more than just tool lanyards and tethering, secondary retention, things like that. It's also about teaching, education, and spreading the awareness and learning what the best practices are for each of your individual work zones. Each industry, each work site within the industry, and each individual job on that work site carries with it a unique set of challenges and risks. This presentation will hopefully give you an outline to create a plan of your own. So the best way to frame it up is to look at it as safety at heights in general, a hierarchy, if you will. Safety at heights can be put into a hierarchy of its own. Staying safe takes on a whole new meaning when working at height. One should look at this as a whole entire topic and then break it down into further categories. So what Ergodyne has done is broken this out into two separate branches of the safety at heights hierarchy. The first on the left, you'll see workers at height, and then this brand new branch, which is often looked over or not thought of at all, is objects at height. So we'll break those down a little bit further. So a variety of topics fall under the workers at heights branch of this hierarchy. For most, the first thing that comes to mind is fall protection. Many companies are beginning to implement effective fall protection practices. Many fall protection manufacturers break down these categories into the ABCs, what they call the ABCs of fall protection, which stand for anchorage, body support, and connectors. So other than fall protection, of course, there's other personal protective equipment that is often used whether you're working at height or not. We're a resource. Ergodyne's a resource for many of these, including hand protection, head protection, high visibility, things like that. Don't look past this category because it often takes on a unique set of needs when used at height rather than when used on the ground. For example, you might need a different type of hard hat when you're working at height. You might need a different vest that has a D-ring slot in it for your fall protection. Things like this should be considered when determining how to protect your worker at height. And then the final category on the far right is breaking down access to height. So this is the physical act of getting the worker to the at heights workplace. Does that individual climb to that location themselves, or is there something that brings them to height? Common devices like ladders, lifts, suspended platforms should be carefully selected. If those aren't used and access is a little bit more technical, rope access equipment, work seats, and other suspension equipment is utilized. So the detail of today's conversation is going to fall under that objects at heights branch of the safety at heights hierarchy. Just like workers at height safety, objects at height safety can be broken down into different categories. For every individual working at height, there's often a whole array of equipment he or she is using when working up there. This can even include safety equipment itself that we just discussed on the previous slide. What comes to mind first in the conversation is the prevention of dropped objects, keeping tools, equipment, and pieces of structure from falling below. But a key takeaway here is that there are other risks associated with objects at height safety. It's not all about dropped object prevention, even though that takes on the bulk of the conversation. One of those topics, one of those categories, is organization at height. An organized work area where equipment is at hand and kept close is even more important when it's at an at heights work location. There are a lot of tools and equipment used at height, and so it's important to keep those organized. Another topic is the physical act of bringing equipment to the at heights work location. So similar to bringing the worker themselves at height, hoisting this equipment, carrying this equipment, those types of things should be considered as well. This can include a worker overloading themselves or hoisting, craning, things like that. And we'll get into more detail on these topics here in a minute. So now that we've kind of framed it up for you, let's discuss objects at heights in a little bit more detail. The starting point for safely managing these hazards is spreading awareness and becoming more educated on the topic, which is why most of you are here today. So like we previously mentioned, dropped objects makes up the bulk of this objects at heights conversation. So let's start by defining what dropped objects is. The dropped object prevention scheme, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail a bit later, breaks dropped objects out into three categories. The first is static dropped objects. This is any object that falls from a stationary position from pure gravity. An example might be that floodlight or megaphone you see in the top photograph there. If that bracket holding that megaphone were to corrode and that megaphone were to fall below from straight gravity, that would be a static dropped object. The second category is dynamic dropped objects. This is any object that is ejected, propelled, or forced to drop by a number of different elements. Examples include maybe a crane hits a platform and knocks a piece of pipe off the ledge of that platform, or a worker simply letting a hammer slip from his or her grip. And then the final category is kinetic dropped objects. This is a little bit newer category, and it's a dropped object as a result of constant vibration. So perhaps like a conveyor belt, the rattling of a conveyor belt might work loose a nut and bolt that holds it together, and that falls below. Anything that is a result of constant vibration is a kinetic dropped object. So if any of you can guess which one of these is most common, well, the research done by that DROPS organization I mentioned within the oil and gas industry specifically found that dynamic dropped objects were found to be the most common. So the next question is, what causes dropped objects? Well, there are thousands of different causes for dropped objects, but a lot of them, most all of them, can be grouped into three different categories. The first is environmental conditions. So I asked someone once, what are some examples of different environmental conditions that could happen? And somebody raised their hand and said an earthquake. And yes, that was a correct answer. An earthquake is an environmental condition that will definitely cause quite a few dropped objects. But other common responses include things like wind, ice, rain, snow, stuff like that. But something that's not often thought of when you mention environmental conditions is temperature. How does the temperature affect the user using that equipment? For example, cold temperatures numbing the fingers and causing a loose grip, or warm temperatures making your hands sweaty and slippery. Those can lead to dropped objects as well. The second category there is fairly self-explanatory. That's striking against or colliding with different objects. So what that means is any impact or sudden movement that propels or jolts an item would fall into this category. Let's say a truck backing into a scissor lift, for example, or an individual tripping and dropping a hand tool. These are a couple different examples of this category. And then the final category is negligence. This is a direct result of the workers themselves. Let's say trying to talk on the radio while climbing, or trying to carry too much equipment to height, or leaving tools on the floor where they might be kicked or knocked over the ledge. Those are examples of negligence. So that summarizes quickly dropped objects. Let's take a sneak peek at the other risks we talked about. The first is organization at height. So a clean, kept work area is important everywhere, but it takes on even more importance when working at height. Keeping tools and equipment organized and at hand is important, especially management of things like cords and ropes and hoses, stuff like that that's often used at height. So there's really three hazards associated with disorganization. The first is a trip hazard. So loose cords and hoses that are laying across a platform, or stray tools and equipment, these can lead to trips, and then if you're at height, falls. So these trips and falls can take on a lot more meaning when the further up you go in the air. The second hazard is unnecessary movement and time at height. So what that means is if you're disorganized, you're continuously looking for the equipment you need. You're moving back and forth more often on the platform. So with that, there's a greater chance of a fall occurring, and there's lost productivity because you're spending more time at height than you need to. The less time at height, the better. And then the third hazard is an increased chance of dropped objects. So if there's a tool laying across the platform, it's pretty easy for someone to walk by and kick that tool off that platform, causing a dropped object. So that's an example of disorganization and how it can turn into a dropped object itself. So remember all of these different risks as you access your at-height work zone. And then the final category of risks is bringing tools and equipment to height. So transportation of this equipment, what is often the case for the workers going to the at-height work location is that they want to prevent leaving anything on the ground that they might need. This probably sounds familiar to a lot of you. So what happens is if they get up there and realize that they've forgotten something on the ground that they need, they'll have to climb all the way back down to get it and then climb back up to perform the job. So they'll often try to overload themselves with equipment just so they don't forget any tool that they might by chance need. So this leads to concerns as well, including ergonomic concerns, sprains and strains, or just simply exhaustion and fatigue from climbing dozens, hundreds of feet and having to deal with that. So proper thought should be put into transportation of equipment to height and the decision of whether or not to hoist it or to carry it up on the person. So who's at risk? Well, frankly, anybody. I mean, what comes to mind most often is at heights work locations. These can include industries like utilities, telecommunications, construction, high-rise construction, all facets of oil and gas really, mining, transportation, and a heck of a lot more. But a key takeaway is that are all dropped object concerns in aerial applications? Well, the answer is no. Chances are if you look around you right now, you might have a ceiling tile or an overhead light or something that could become a potential dropped object. Something propped up against the wall or a structure that could tip over, that would be considered a dropped object as well. So this is why steel-toe boots are worn in factories and warehouses and things like that. In almost any application and work zone you go to, there is some concern for a dropped object hazard or an object's at height safety risk. So what are the costs of not taking action then? Well, the costs of not taking action really fall into three different categories. The first category is the most obvious, and that's potential injury or worse, fatality. The second category is damage caused to something other than the individual themselves. And then the third category is lost productivity. So let's take a look at each of these a little bit further. The first cost of dropped objects is the worst case scenario, and that's what every safety professional dedicates themselves to, and that's potential injury or Lord forbid, a fatality. When discussing who is potentially harmed by falling objects, the first person that comes to mind is somebody working below. No doubt if you ask what should be prevented in eliminating dropped objects, they would say harm to the individuals located below that work location. However, what you shouldn't forget is the person doing the work themselves. Let's say a falling object is fairly heavy and it snags the individual's fall protection lanyard as it's falling below. Or the individual is taking precaution and tethering their equipment rather to a heavy tool. When that tool falls, where is the momentum of that individual going? That's right, the chances of that tool throwing the individual off balance or pulling them, let's say, from a ladder increases a great deal depending on how heavy that object could be. It's important to consider the workers at height as well as individuals below when you're talking about who could potentially be harmed. So to detail a little bit further in the costs, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks workplace fatalities, and in 2010 they released different trends and came up with this chart. They have since updated some of these numbers for 2011, which we'll talk about on the next couple slides. But what this chart represents is the 4 leading causes of fatality in the workplace. The number one cause is represented by that blue line, and that's highway incidents. So that could be traffic-related, struck-bys, things of that nature. The second highest is falls, which is represented by that green line. So that could be falls from heights or standard slips, trips, and falls from the same level. And thankfully, we've seen a nice trend downward in homicides in the workplace. So I think we all like each other a lot better. And then the fourth category, represented by that purple line, is all struck by incidents other than highway incidents. And that could be struck by a piece of machinery or a projectile or something like that. but it also represents falling objects. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see the updated numbers for 2011. In 2011 in the United States, there were 476 fatalities in this struck by category. This is up from 2010, which was just over 400. Of these struck by incidents, 219 of these fatalities were caused by a falling object. And this is actually down from 2010, where it was 263. So if you do the math, it represents just under half of all struck by fatalities and represents 5% of all workplace fatalities. So if you look at a trend line, you can see on the next slide that over the past 5-6 years, we saw a nice trend downward, and the struck by category actually in 2011 increased as a whole, but the falling object component, which is represented by the orange section of each bar, actually has decreased from 2010, which is a good sign. However, struck bys in general have increased, which is unfortunate. But hopefully this is a result of increased awareness and people putting procedures in place, but there's still quite a bit of work to do. Now across the pond in the UK, they detail this out into a few different lower levels. So they detail it in reported incidents. So this could be any type of 3+ days away from work, fatalities, first aid, things like that. And in this struck by category, they noted just under 13,000 incidents from the struck by moving and falling objects. Of these, just under 1,900 were related to falling objects, which is represented on the next slide by categories of falling objects that they break down. So you'll notice on the far right, you see that number of 1,880 incidents from falling objects. They actually break down the falling object into type. So whether it be free falling from structure, free falling from lifting machinery or vehicle, or ejected while using machinery or hand tools. And the bulk of them fall into that orange category, the second category, and that's free falling from machinery and equipment. Should be noted that these are not fatalities. These are just incidents involving falling objects. So the UK has done a nice job of actually breaking it down a little bit further. So let's put a dollar value on that. Not that it matters, because the biggest thing is bringing those workers safely at home at night. But to put a dollar value on it, in 2011, the National Safety Council estimated that a medically consulted injury was about $37,000 to the company. But for a fatal accident, the average was $1.35 million of direct costs associated with a fatal accident. So if you do the math and bring in that 219 fatalities the United States saw in 2011, multiply it by the 1.35 million, it costs companies just under $300 million alone for falling object fatalities in the United States. So those numbers certainly add up. But as mentioned, the most important thing is workers coming home to their families at night. So the second category of costs, we talked about injury and fatality. The second category is damage. And damage can happen to three different things. The first is the dropped object itself could be damaged in a fall. The second is an object that dropped object hits below. And the third one is the structure being worked on. So if you imagine a $2,500 laser alignment device being used by a wind energy technician dropping 200 feet below onto that technician's truck, that can add up quickly. Or if that alignment device happened to skip off the surface of that wind nacelle, it would damage the wind turbine, it would damage the piece of equipment, and it would damage an object below, being the truck. all of that damage can add up rather quickly. Other examples of sensitive surfaces include things like the surface of an aircraft, our friends in the solar industry, for solar panels, things like that. And then the final category of cost is lost productivity. So imagine this scenario. You've just climbed up, you're worn out, you've climbed over 200 feet to do the work you need to do on a tower or a rig or something like that, and oops, you just dropped the piece of equipment you need to do the job. Now, no one got hurt, maybe even the piece of equipment isn't damaged, but now you have to climb all the way back down, retrieve that piece of equipment, and climb all the way back up to do the job. If we're talking a 200-foot tower, that could be a half day, a full day of lost productivity. So obviously not as concerning as a fatality or an injury, but a cost nonetheless. So let's discuss now some objects at height solutions and break those down. At Ergodyne, we discuss objects at height solutions. We put a lot of our solutions into the hierarchy of controls. So we'll categorize objects at height specifically into this hierarchy. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the hierarchy of controls and how it works off the way this slide is positioned on a top-down approach. So whenever possible, you want to eliminate the hazard. So let's use changing the simple task, well, I guess not simple, depending on your work site, of changing a light bulb as an at heights example. You could eliminate that hazard by getting rid of the light altogether. Let's say you open up a skylight in a building, or you put that light on the ground instead of at height. This would be physically eliminating the need to go to height to change the light bulb. If that's not possible, you want to see if you can substitute or change the act of going to height. For example, let's say, I know these devices are out there, but a telescoping pole that allows you to bring it up and change the light bulb from the ground. That removes you from having to go to height to change it. But because eliminating and substituting are often not feasible, we're going to spend our time and focus on the bottom three categories. So let's start at the very bottom and define PPE, or personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment is at the bottom because people want it to be a last resort. So within the conversation of objects at heights and specifically dropped object safety, PPE solutions are secondary protection solutions. They protect a worker by covering them or deflecting an object so that it doesn't cause as much damage. They do not actually keep the item from falling itself. Examples of PPE solutions in this conversation include common pieces of equipment like hard hats, steel-toed boots, but we also put in netting, toe boards, and things like that into this category because they don't prevent the item from falling. They simply catch it, deflect it, or cause less damage if it does fall. So the second category is administrative controls. In the objects at heights realm, these include procedures like requiring individuals to hoist equipment when it reaches a certain weight. This circles back to our conversation a bit earlier regarding the transportation of equipment and tools to height. An example of a workers at height procedure when transitioning heights includes maintaining 3 points of contact, for example. That's a procedure. An objects at heights procedure in this same conversation might be to implement a practice that if the individual is carrying more than 20 pounds of equipment on their body, that equipment needs to be loaded into a container and hoisted to height. Other examples of procedures and administrative controls include roping areas off and creating red areas or no-go zones, so that individuals do not go into this area so they won't be hit by anything. An important controlling measure is to do exactly what we're doing today, and that's spread awareness, educate your workforce, educate ourselves on best practice. That's all part of administrative controls. So let's talk about engineering controls next. So we at Ergodyne, at least, define engineering controls as aiming to avoid the falling objects from occurring altogether. This is the prevention of dropped objects through things like tethering, secondary retention, topping containers. It's the act of keeping objects from falling below. In the hierarchy, engineering controls are preferred. Now, an important distinction should be made that it's not about if you use one of these procedures, you shouldn't have to worry about PPE or shouldn't have to worry about administrative controls. It's about implementing all of these together and complementing one another so that you can come up with a full attack on preventing this from occurring. So what do the regulators say? Let's talk about Osha first. Now, I have to apologize. These next couple slides are a bit of an eyesore, and they're script taking from 1926 specifically. So we'll just summarize them quickly, and then if there's any questions, we can come back to them. So the first section describes protection from falling objects. It talks about the responsibility being on the employer to make sure employees wear hard hats, and that there's other procedures in place like erecting toe boards, canopies, things like that. The next section is the scaffolding section, and that continues to talk about administrative controls like barricading areas off, creating red areas and no-go zones, things like that. And then the final section that actually mentions the word prevention is in this particular section where it says securing loose items aloft. All materials, equipment, and tools which are not in use while aloft shall be secured against accidental displacement. So other than that particular note, OSHA does not clearly recognize the hazards, and when they mention solutions, they talk about protection solutions. They don't talk about further up in the hierarchy of controls mentioning prevention. So if we jump back across the pond and look at the health and safety executive, the HSE does more clearly define protection from falling objects, but they don't get specific. They put the responsibility on the employer and state if it's not reasonably practical, you must ensure that no one is injured by anything falling. Other regions that are coming out with some specific language include Australia, and specifically in Queensland, Norway. Their oil and gas community are leaders in this conversation. In Canada, they don't specifically mention anything about dropped objects, but they do put the liability in the employer's hands. Bottom line is the global awareness on this discussion is rising, so we encourage you to pay attention to it and work it into your planning. The one organization that I did mention early on in the discussion was the DROPS organization. DROPS literally stands for the Dropped Object Prevention Scheme. They are focused on the oil and gas industry specifically, but a lot of what they have come up with can be taken and used and formed and put into other industries. They have different committees around the globe. Ergodyne is part of the North American Committee and members of the DROPS organization. We held our first U.S. forum, or North American forum, I should say, last week in Houston, Texas, and it went off very well. We had about 25 individuals there from the oil and gas community and talked about best practice and continued the conversation. If you'll take a look at the next slide, you can see all the different members. Some of you on the call today might be employed by one of these organizations and not even know that you're part of this community. Somewhere around the globe, there is an individual with your company that might be part of it. So if you see your company logo on it, we encourage you to reach out to the DROPS website, or of course you can contact Ergodyne as well and we'll route you in the right direction. And check out dropsonline.org for more information about this organization. An example of one of the tools that the DROPS organization has created is this Dropped Object Potential Consequences Calculator. So what this does is allow individuals to kind of categorize what the potential consequence might be if a dropped object happened. So the different colors you see here represent different severities of an incident. So red being fatality, the orange being a day away from work case, the yellow being a recordable case, and then the green being a first aid case. So with this, there's an X and Y axis here depending on the height of the drop and the weight of the item that's dropped and where that falls in this potential consequence calculator. So some considerations include these are blunt objects. It doesn't consider things like shards of glass or shards of metal or something like that that could fall and have a better chance of piercing the skin. And it also considers that standard PPE is worn, including hard hats and steel toes, things like that. So let's try an example. So let's say you're working approximately 80 feet up, and at that height you're using a wrench that is just under a pound, 3/4 of a pound. Or let's say you're using an object that doesn't really get thought of when you're talking about dangerous falling objects. And let's say a bottle of water that weighs the same amount as that wrench being dropped. Where potentially could this fall in the potential consequence calculator if one of these two items were to fall? If you look at the weight, you look at the height and find your spot on the graph, the result is a potential fatality could happen if something as innocent as a bottle of water or a lightweight wrench were dropped approximately 78 feet. So again, this is just a guide, but it kind of gives individuals a little bit of a guideline on where things could be and how severe something you wouldn't normally think of as being dangerous could end up becoming when gravity is involved. So let's jump back and look at solutions again, and rather than define them, let's look at some examples of some potential solutions. We'll start with administrative controls. Administrative solutions are often complementary to other solutions within the hierarchy of controls. And it's exactly what we're doing today. We're learning about it, we're educating ourselves on it, and we're spreading awareness about objects at heights. Awareness tools could be hard hat stickers, break room signs, things like that that help you can pin up on the job site and help people get talking about the conversation. Training solutions include webinars like this, white papers, and other items that you can help yourselves learn more about the potential consequences and put best practices into place. And then it also includes those procedures, red areas, no-go zones, 3 points of contact, stuff like that. A new example that Ergodyne has come up with is teaching people through our Tenacious University and our Drop Cop Academy. So you can go online, view videos, download content to help you learn more about it. We have a new video up on the website now that talks about choosing a tool lanyard and the dynamic forces involved with the specific tool lanyard you choose. Engineering controls then, we'll talk about that. We're not going to talk about specific product. We'll kind of go over it in general, but if you're interested in Ergodyne product, please feel free to visit our website. So like the ABCs of fall protection, what we've defined Objects at Height solutions, we've put those into the 3 T's of aerial safety, and that's tethered, topped, and tagged. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So the first T is tethered, and what often comes to mind, and probably the most popular solution out there, is a tool lanyard. So the key is knowing what tool lanyard to choose on the job. So there are a lot of different specific tool lanyards out there. So let's talk a little bit more about what those considerations are when choosing a tool lanyard. There's 5 considerations you should take into account. The first is capacity. That's the weight of the item being tethered. Now, why this is so important in the conversation of dropped object prevention and objects at height safety is that, let's say with fall protection, you're choosing a harness for your workers. Those workers, even though they might fudge the numbers 10 pounds here and there, they know how much they weigh. So when choosing a harness, you can match that harness's capacity to the worker's weight. However, do you think your workers are weighing every single tool that they're carrying on them? No, they're not. So capacity should be taken into consideration when you're talking about this. Other considerations are the length, the level of clearance needed, connectors, what type of connection you should use, and then price sensitivity. So examples of different connections could be dependent on the industry, depending on what your particular work site needs are. So tool lanyards and tool lanyard connectors have evolved just in the last 2 years. They're starting to move from non-captive eye, non-locking carabiners into more locking, captive eye carabiners that have different materials and different features depending on the needs. Swiveling features of the connector you see on the far right, or a stainless steel carabiner you see in the middle. Depending on what type of application you're at and what type of needs your specific job has, choosing a tool lanyard is important. Now, it's not about just tethering tools. We like to teach to tether everything that's going to height. So that includes the PPE being worn. So eyewear lanyards, hard hat lanyards are available if you're not using chin straps. Glove grabbers so that your gloves don't fall. Now these items may not hurt anybody if they fall below, but do you think that worker's going to climb back down and grab that safety equipment, put it back on, and climb back up? The answer is probably no. So keeping the PPE tethered to them will help keep them safe. The second T we discussed is topped. So these include different pouches, different bags that the individual might be using themselves. So we talked about whether or not they're carrying equipment on their person or are they putting it in a container and hoisting it up. If they're carrying it on themselves, a tool pouch or a bolt bag with a cover or lid on it is extremely important, because if that were to get inverted, if they're to bend over, the items inside aren't going to fall out and hit the ground. If the choice is to hoist the equipment, perhaps a hoist bucket's being used. Now it's important to use a hoist bucket with a lid on it as well, because as you're hoisting that up, the individuals even have less control over hoist buckets because it's not on their belt. So hoist buckets with lids that are weight rated are extremely important. And then the final T in discussion is tagged, or tested rather. So if at height equipment like ladders and lifts and fall protection and stuff like that has a weight rating on it, shouldn't all the equipment you're using to tether your tools and equipment have a weight rating on it as well? Buckets, tool lanyards, bags, things like that should look for a stamped weight rating from the manufacturer on these products, so you know you're using a quality piece of equipment. Another important thing is safety factors. So I mentioned before, when you're talking about capacity, it's pretty often that people aren't going to know exactly how much a particular tool weighs. So having a safety factor built into that tool lanyard or built into that bucket is extremely important, because if an individual is using a tool lanyard that's rated at 10 pounds, it's probably a good chance that they could hook an 11-pound tool to it and just not know the difference. So by having equipment that's rated to, let's say, a 2-to-1 safety factor or a 4-to-1 safety factor, that has that built in so that if that misuse occurs, the workers are still going to be safe. So ask manufacturers about safety factors when choosing your equipment. And this is all about learning. So an example of what we've come up with includes measuring the dynamic forces involved in a dropped object. This has been done with fall protection for many years. So what we at Ergodyne have done, we're starting to measure the forces different weights generate in a fall and how those different forces change depending on the tool lanyard or piece of equipment you use. And we're finding that some equipment is much better than the others. And some additional solutions to think about, we kind of define as gripped and zipped. So gripped is rather obvious. That's what kind of grip does the individual have. So it's important to have good grip when it's your best means of preventing a drop for the most part. There are a variety of different elements that can affect your grip, and choosing like the appropriate gloves, for instance, could increase your grip, or let's say hand warmers, something like that, if you're working in cold environments to prevent those numb fingers from occurring, could increase your grip. So that's the gripped component of it. And then when we're talking about zips, we talk about cord organization and cord organizers. Keeping those cords, those hoses, those ropes up off the platform, up off the ground, so that they don't become trip hazards. There are all sorts of different solutions for cord organization out there, so make sure those things are up off the platform. And then finally, it's important to consider your standard tool and gear organizers. So when used at height, these tool bags and boxes should keep everything retained and secure. You'll want to stay away from open-top organizers, 5-gallon pails that have wire handles on them, and make sure all your containers can be closed, can have a lid on them, and keeping the small items in particular organized, maybe within the larger organizers, is important to consider as well. So as we bring things to a close here, let's take a look at some hazard identification. So what's wrong with this particular picture? Well, if you look close, you can see that these individuals working out of these lifts, they don't have these tools tethered. So the drills they're using can be dropped down to the ground. Hopefully no one's walking below, or the drill itself isn't damaged. The second one's a little less obvious. Just give you a second to kind of look at that photograph, see if you can see anything there that looks a little out of whack. Did everybody see that crowbar leaning up against the crate? People probably have walked by this time and time again throughout the day, and it just kind of blends in. If that gets hoisted up or forklift up, that crowbar can become a potential dropped object. And then how about this particular image? Well, if you look close, you'd see that that bucket being hoisted up on that tower didn't have a lid on it. Remember when I said that they have less control over the hoisting buckets? They don't have a heck of a lot of control over this. So if this hoist bucket were to get caught on the other section of the tower way up top, as they're putting it on, it could spill the contents of that bucket down and rain it below onto whoever might be unfortunate enough to be underneath. And then finally, take a look at this photo, and it's pretty obvious what you see. Try walking to the end of that platform without tripping. That's an example of cord organization, rope organization, and getting all that up off the platform so you have a clear path. So before we jump into Q&A, let's take a moment and review everything we've discussed. So objects at height safety management should be part of every safety at heights plan. Do not forget that for every worker going to heights, there are multiple tools and pieces of equipment being used by that worker. Secure the people and the objects. Second, dropped object prevention is the most obvious hazard within objects at height safety. But remember that organization and transportation of that equipment and gear are important topics to consider as well. Third, use the hierarchy of controls by implementing engineering controls in addition to PPE solutions and administrative controls. It's not about choosing one or the other. It's about complementing all of them together to have the best overall solution. Fourth, remember the 3 T's, tethered, topped, and tagged, to help choose your solutions. And then finally, you can always use Ergodyne as a resource. In addition to solutions, we offer a lot of training materials, partner with folks to do webinars like this, and offer a lot of different awareness materials as well. So congratulations, everybody who's hung with us on this call. You have earned your badge. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kyle, and we will open up the Q&A session, I believe.
Great. Thank you for that fantastic presentation, Nate. Before we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to remind everybody of the short evaluation survey I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to pop it onto everyone's screen now, and we're just asking that you please consider completing the survey to let us know your thoughts. Any input you can give us is important as it will help improve future webcasts. So I hope you take the time to fill out the survey. If you do not see the evaluation survey on your screen, please turn off your pop-up blocker. All right, now let's get to some of the questions that we have. Nate, earlier in the presentation, you mentioned some regulations that are out there both in Europe and the United States. Are there any future regulations that might come out at some point soon that you're aware of?
It's an excellent question, and it comes up all the time. I don't know for certain. I don't know of any real active, detailed conversation going on with the regulatory bodies. I do know that organizations like DROPS are creating a lot of awareness and making a lot of noise. And I know that manufacturers are stepping up and implementing different procedures in their equipment. And folks like Ergodyne sit on these regulatory boards and help bring up topics for future consideration. So with that momentum in place, if there's not any active, detailed conversation going on now, you can be pretty confident that there will be in the very near future, and standards will follow.
Okay, great. You gave some solutions today of what folks can do in the event, to prevent falling objects. In your opinion, if there was one thing that everyone should start doing immediately today that could prevent, things like losses and injuries and so forth, what would that one thing be?
Well, I think that a lot of the safety professionals would say that the first step is really just knowing about this. People are doing a wonderful job implementing great fall protection procedures into their work sites and into different applications. I would encourage them to work objects at height safety into their planning, because it all starts with planning. And then I won't recommend a particular piece of equipment at this point, but the more you can start learning and the more you can start planning to help prevent dropped objects, the equipment will fall into place after that. And of course, you can reach out to us if you have any questions.
Great, thank you. You talked a lot about the folks who are working, up high, what they can do to prevent objects from falling down. What about, people who are on the ground, workers who might be on the ground? Should there be, an area that's cordoned off from elevated work? And if so, is there any sort of formula that people can use to determine how far back people should be away from that elevated work?
Well, yeah, the really roping off and barricading off is an administrative control, so that should be put into place as well as PPE and hopefully dropped object prevention. So if you're talking about individuals below protecting themselves from objects falling above, I think each individual industry and particular company and work site has their own measures of how far back individuals need to be. And, the higher you go, the farther out that area should be, because there's more opportunity for it to get farther out. Drops describes it as kind of a cone, if you will. So there's no real strict procedures put in place, but I would just encourage folks as the higher up they go, the further out that those barricaded areas should probably be. But there's multiple things individuals can do on the ground. Number one is stay away, of course, but the other is just know that work is going on and there's a potential for that above.
Okay, fantastic. We have time for one more question before we have to end the presentation. What type of how would you secure certain types of equipment that may be difficult to secure, such as a spud wrench, things along those lines that may not necessarily have a real excellent means of attaching a lanyard or something like that to them?
Yeah, in addition to the standards question, that's probably the second most often question asked. We specifically have some solutions and more in the works for creating retrofit attachment points that have safety factors built in that are very easy, self-explanatory to connect. There are some solutions out there in terms of retrofitting tools. However, you have to be very cautious what you do to a tool. For example, don't drill into it. You'll probably take your manufacturer's warranty away from the tool manufacturer. There's also some solutions that we've found, we've brought in, we've tested that don't really do it and are very difficult to attach. So if your tool doesn't have a connection point on it, you might want to start with the tool manufacturer to see if there's an option for a tool that does. Otherwise, you can reach out to maybe a retrofit solution manufacturer like us and ask, because I know there'll be some great things coming down the pipe.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nate. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I apologize. There are several questions we didn't get a chance to address, but don't worry. All of those unanswered questions are going to be forwarded on to Nate, and he can get back to you. So once again, I want to hope that you take time to fill out the survey and give us your feedback. And with that, that concludes the Safety and Health webcast for today. I'd like to thank Nate, Ergodyne, and everyone who listened in. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks, Kyle. Everyone have a great day.